Hey folks, it's Professor Diffley again. This is History 100, Chapter 9, Part 2, Lecture Video 2. So we left off with the rise of the Martel family. So that brings us to Charlemagne and the rise of his kingdom here, which will later, his descendants will create into a Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne, really just Charles the Great in French. That's where the name comes from. You can see very long-lived a ruler here. Again, Charlemagne, and there's a video on this. I'll give you some stuff. The video also goes into good detail about this. A very complex character. This is a warrior, sometimes a very brutal warrior, who ruled by force and will. Used some sort of burn it all down attacks on people, but at the same time also led to a Renaissance, the Carolinian Renaissance, which creates things like the writing that you have today, Carolinian minuscule, trying to standardize the written language, created essentially, you could actually argue, and convincingly so, that he is responsible for the creation of things like the question mark. So here's someone who is a brutal warrior, completely uneducated, never learns to read or write himself, but supports writing and supports learning, supports education. So it's often difficult to meld the two of these here. But he really did have an imperial vision and goal, is going to really try to recreate the Roman imperial vision by creating a new capital in the Roman model. Support for the arts, support for education, things like that is really going to go there. How does he do this? Territorial conquest and expansion, yearly conquests, motivations, spread the religion, but also very highly religious here, spread the religion, also increase the scope of his empire. Their tactics often used very, like I said, scorched earth techniques, it would completely destroy areas if necessary. Also went into battle himself. The stories of Charlemagne, who was gigantic for his time, well over 6 foot, used a great sword, a giant sword, almost the size of a full-grown person that he could, cut people down in one swing, cut them in half, that sort of thing. This mythical leader here. Again, the scope of his conquests are going to go into modern-day Germany of what it would be. And so, for the first time since the Roman Empire, this is really the first great empire. Again, compared to the Romans and other empires, it's not that big. But since the fall of the Romans, in Europe at least, right, we're not talking about the Muslim empires, which are far larger than this, but this is the beginning of that there. It will later grow into the Holy Roman Empire, which will last for centuries upon centuries later. So Charlemagne's kingdom here creates a new capital at Aachen, and really does use the Roman imperial model again. That brings in advisors, support of the arts, support of education, trying to standardize rules and laws there. He's going to even have his Missi Dominici, his own bureaucrats in a way, that are going to go out and carry forward the Charlemagne's orders, and really try to bring this unity to the empire. The empire's economy, the Carolinian Empire, an economy, importance of land. I mean, as that will be the case for a while, land is a basis of wealth, especially in these agricultural communities. But he's also going to, garner a lot of wealth through conquest. One of the things he's going to start to do is using the rivers for conquest and navigation for trade. So he's going to build all these checkpoints and fortifications along the rivers that can increase trade within his empire, by providing security along the roads, things like that. And just to back out, like I said, you can take a look here as it has all these different the notes here for a lot of this there. So just remember to take a look at that. Just wanted to remind you on that. So I'm moving over here, but yeah, you can see how far it's going to go. I mean, this is a pretty large territory. It includes much of Germany, much of France, and other modern states here. But as you can see, as the sub map here, eventually after he dies, his sons are going to, in many ways, divide up the empire. Unfortunately for them, it's they don't stay united, but they'll take different parts of it. In the Treaty of Verdun, the empire is divided amongst them. But this is really, expanding further and further than anywhere had ever gone since the Romans there. And you can see the different groups they're fighting against. Creates this tributary provinces, these borderlands there. Again, the tributary provinces are not under his full control. They pay tribute to him. This will be a problem, though, later. They're not as strong as they could be. And when you get the invasions that are going to happen of other groups, and during this era, it's going to make his empire a little bit easier to attack here. So one of the things about how does Charlemagne become an emperor? Now, this is interesting. I mean, Charlemagne is the true ruler, true power here, through the force of his armies, force of his will, creating all these. One of the things you get is that this concept of the donation of Constantine. What happens is the Pope's officials essentially forge a document claiming that Emperor Constantine, from way back when, had actually given the Pope Italy and control of all this. And not really the truth, but this gives them their claim and at least a legal basis, even though if it is a forgery. But one of these is you have Pope Leo, and this is where Charlemagne really comes in. Pope Leo III had some troubles. Essentially, he got into heat with his local nobles and others because he was kind of sleeping with people's wives, imprisoning people, taking not exactly acting what we would think a religious leader would do, but nonetheless, let's focus on what he did. So he's got troubles. He is essentially seized and almost killed by all these people he had upset. And Charlemagne intervenes to save him. Charlemagne's armies and him march into Italy, restore the Pope to the throne. To power there, because remember, by this point, again, the Pope is one of the largest landowners. Acts like a monarch as much as a religious leader in most ways. But this comes to the story of the coronation of Charlemagne. So. The story goes to reward Charlemagne for his defense of the Pope. The Pope invites him to Rome for a Christmas Day Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. Charlemagne goes in and is supposed to be the guest of honor. The story goes more or less, and there's a little variation of the story in the video, the Khan Academy video that you have this week too, is that as Charlemagne is praying, the Pope puts a crown on Charlemagne's head and says, "I declare you emperor of this territory." Now, so some argue that some sources say that Charlemagne says at the end of this, if that he had known what was about to happen, he never would have stepped foot in that church. The Pope gives him all these titles. Charlemagne, for a long time, refuses to use them. Why? Well, this is the significance here. The Pope. Charlemagne was ruler himself. He did not need the Pope's blessing, right? He had conquered this territory himself. He'd ruled it. He'd actually propped up the Pope at this point and supported him. But in doing so, the Pope made himself kingmaker and arguably the most important religious political figure, but even political figure in Western Europe for the Catholic countries. Going forward, now it's essentially what the Pope is saying, and the message that comes out of this is you are only emperor if the Pope says so. And Charlemagne, refuses to use his titles for a long time. Eventually, will accept them though. But yeah, from this point on, royal coronations, especially in Catholic lands, and for emperor, are going to be done by the Pope. An interesting continuance of this story is that about 1,000 years later, actually almost exactly 1,000 years, Napoleon Bonaparte of France will finally patch things up after the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, there's a major divide between the Catholic Church and the revolutionaries. Napoleon seizes power and eventually is crowned emperor. But what Napoleon does 1,000 years later is crowns himself emperor, even though the Pope is on hand. The Pope no longer has that power. But that just gives you an idea for nearly 1,000 years, at least in the Catholic lands. When you get later to the Protestant Reformation and all that in the 1400s, you will get a split in the church there. But the Pope will be a significant political power in all this. This is a picture of Charlemagne's chapel at Aachen, his cathedral. You can see it using Romanesque art and technology, architecture here, harkening back to the Romans again, outwardly tying themselves in. And that's something you're going to see for the rest of the European history here, is lots of different powers, and including into United States history, is different groups tying themselves back to Rome, either outwardly through architecture, use of names like the Senate, the use of the fasci, and others. and here actually using the Roman architecture. And that brings us to the Carolinian Renaissance, and a revival of learning and art under Charlemagne. Again, this is part of the idea of his complexity. There is a major revival of learning and art. One of it is he relies on others. So he goes to Alcuin of York from the British Isles, brings him in as a top advisor and educator. He was believed to be the smartest man at the time, and really does help, again, how do I put this, standardize a lot of the teaching. And one of the problems you had at this point is you have there's no real standardization in language and writing. You have many, they set up schools for clerics, for priests, things like that. There's no unified system of learning for them, and so the goals of the Renaissance does that. It also strengthens the hand of Charlemagne. Like he will have the children of his nobles and others send their children to the capital and to Aachen and be taught under Charlemagne's overwatch and that. So again, they're creating more of that legacy of this. Again, we really do have beginning Carolinian Mini School, creation of things like standardized writing and the question mark and things like that. Again, you can see the video goes into really good detail. You can see some of the art that's created, again, mixing some of these different views. It's Christian, but it's also got throwbacks to Rome and Greece and that there. What happens is later you're going to have Charlemagne's successors. Again, there is going to be rebellions and fights between the children. Eventually, the Treaty of Verdun divides the empire into these three different groups. Essentially, then the empire dissolves to a degree, and then you're going to get these Viking, Muslim, and Magyar invasions further and further that are also going to sort of bring down this centralization that Charlemagne had created. Will then lead to fragmentation, but eventually, out of the ruins of all this, you will get the rise of a truly holy Roman empire. Again, even though Charlemagne claims to be that, he's neither holy nor Roman, and not clearly the emperor. This is the beginning of it. Charlemagne is, there's some debate on this. I would argue it actually comes later to the Holy Roman Empire, but you could trace its origins back to this. And again, you could see how the empires, and it will divide across Europe here by 1050. You can see over here the rise of the Kievan Rus in Croatia and Hungary. Over here, you're going to get more and more of the Slavic peoples, Poland, the German kingdoms, France, Al-Andalus, controlled by the Muslim empires there, and then Castile and Aragon, which will later in 1492, be completely unified to overthrow. Here, you have papal states. You can see there is still division. You can also see over here, though, is that the Byzantine Empire, we started here, had begun to make some inroads in gathering its land back and taking it back, but as you can see, by the end of this, it begins to lose some of it. And so what we're going to deal with in the next part of this is life in medieval Europe. I'm going to look at the feudal system in more depth, and so I'll start off with that in lecture video 3.